Welcome back, everybody, to another interview episode of the Video Game Newsroom Time Machine. This is part 3 of my interview with Graeme Bayless, a true video game veteran. This is probably the best way to say it. If you haven't watched parts 1 and part 2, please go ahead and do that. We're just going to be jumping right in here with, well, the collapse of Sierra, the collapse of Dynamix. Graeme has to move on once again, and this time he's going to end up at a little company called Electronic Arts, and more specifically, their Florida subsidiary, Tiburon. So, enjoy.
Part of the, one of the first waves of layoffs that took place at Dynamix, they, went through a series of those right before the shutdown. So I was in that wave, and so I found myself in, basically, what is that, 99, looking for a job, and which is, is sad. This is the first time I'd actually put down roots. I bought a house in Eugene. I had, thought that this was the place I was going to stay, and then, it is what it is. So I ended up doing looking around quite a bit at that time and trying to, because at this point I've been in the industry for at least a little while, and I'm like, I'd really like to, find the place, because I think I mentioned this before, that I kind of am an all-in kind of guy, right? So when I sign on to an organization, I kind of give all of me. And my hope and expectation is that that will be the same. Dynamix was one of the very first where that was a clear example of that not going both directions. So one of the amusing anecdotes, if this doesn't scare people off the industry, I don't know what will. But I took my first legitimate vacation with my wife, like more than a 3-day weekend vacation. And by the way, our honeymoon was basically a 4-day weekend, because wow. I was working in the game industry at the time. I was working at Sega. Anyway, so my first legitimate, real, vacation didn't happen until, I want to say, 2008. Right. Wow. So, we'd been married a while before we actually took a vacation. We'd actually bought the tickets and were planning to go to the United Kingdom when I was working at Dynamix. And that was right when things were beginning to get a little sketchy. And then I got asked to take on those projects we discussed previously, the Fast Attack, etc. And I canceled my vacation and ended up, getting a partial refund of the tickets and eating the cost delta. And, it was always in my head. I'm like, it's okay. It's, I'm doing what I need to do to help the company out. And doesn't always go both ways. So that was the one of the first wake up calls for me. And you would think I would have learned that from Media Vision, but I guess I'm slow. Anyway, so. So yeah, it's 1999, and I left there, or rather, they left me, and so I started looking for places to land, and I had conversations with a number of places. I talked with Activision, I talked with Ensemble Studios, I talked with and basically several possibilities, but the one I ended up landing with was EA. I had flirted. Go ahead.
Yeah, sorry, I got to ask, because you've been in the industry for quite a while. This is still, it's early days of the internet's already there and everything else, but it's not really the days of LinkedIn and whatnot. what role did your contacts in the industry play during this job search? I mean, what does job searching in the industry at this point for a veteran like you look like?
Great question. Because it was definitely different than it is now. What are commonly referred to, at least within the industry, as headhunters did exist at that period. And so I had several who I had formed friendships with. And so I was fortunate enough to have several people who viewed me as a, potentially, valuable commodity, for lack of a better term. And so they were willing to try and, present me to several possible companies, right? And so that led to a lot of these types of conversations. Yes, it was my network, but I'll be honest, it was probably as much my network of hiring professionals, both contractors and independent, headhunters that ran businesses that did that for companies. And at that time, I think that was actually more prevalent. I would say that back then, most companies didn't have an internal recruiter that they felt they could depend on to sort of, reliably do that. They had recruiters, certainly, but I would say the independent search companies that would be hired by companies was more frequent than it is now, where while they still exist, a lot of the companies sort of have their own infrastructure for that, and they will, while they will dabble with the outside search agencies, I think that sort of personal touch and personal connection has faded a bit. Back then, it was very much kind of a personal touch type of business. Now, recruiting agencies are basically more often than not shotgun houses, with the exception of executive search, right? Obviously, executive search is still very much that way. But I'd say it's reserved for the upper echelons. Most of the time, the rank and file is pretty much, blap, let's sort of send it to everybody and see what sticks, sort of thing. So in my case, I was fortunate enough to have a bunch of contacts and friends who were, worked in that space as recruiters. And so I was presented to a range of companies and had plenty of opportunities. It is interesting in hindsight now, because I always kind of thought that, like this mistake that many in the industry have made through the years, I always thought it would be that way forever. It most assuredly does not stay that way, did not stay that way. And on top of that, I discovered at one point that ageism is very much a thing in this business. And so as I've gotten older, I've found that is harder and harder, that job switching is harder and harder. And more often than not, companies are more likely to bet on somebody who's young and fresh as opposed to old and worn out, so to speak. And so it's definitely a different world than it was for multiple reasons. But in that particular case, I was certainly getting a chance to talk to a lot of different places, and I was I was definitely interested in sort of seeing what was out there. I was actually really interested in Ensemble because it was kind of right up my alley. Age of Empires was obviously interesting and successful game. It was kind of in my wheelhouse as a amateur historian, and obviously coming from SSI roots, a deep interest in historical wargaming. And so I was certainly excited to get a chance to talk with them. That one was an interesting set of interviews. I really liked the company. Their interview process was as rigorous as they come. Basically, their deal, or at the time, their deal was basically you have to get 100% vote and you have to meet everyone. So basically, unless everybody in the company says you're in, then you're not. And I'm like, wow. Okay, that's cool. And so, you go through a series of the interviews, and then you kind of get a mass interview sort of thing. It had a little auditorium and stuff. It was very interesting. but that was a fascinating place, and I'll mention this just because it's an interesting anecdote that I'll come back to later. I won't name names because that's not cool.
No.
But one of the people that I interviewed with, it was one of them, a good example of a challenging personality interview, right? A circumstance where I walked in the door, and before I even shook hands, before anything else, this person was sitting at their desk, and before I got anywhere, the first question out of their mouth was, "How many million unit selling titles have you shipped?" "I've shipped 3.
Wow.
That was their open. And I was like, okay. And, my response was, well, none. But I've never shipped a game that lost money, which I thought was a pretty good comeback, right? I thought that was actually pretty reasonable. But that set off an interesting interview with that individual. It was a fun time. I really liked the people that I met there and got a chance to talk to. Ultimately, I ended up not getting that job. I don't know. Someone there decided that I was not the perfect fit. And although they seemed to like me, I ended up getting a pass, which was unusual for me because usually I would go into a place and I would get an offer and then I would choose. And this was sort of the first time I was like, wait, they didn't choose me. I'm confused, right? Which is good. I mean, that's fine. And so ended up also interviewing with EA. And that was also, since we're on the topic of interviews, a fascinating interview. That was a different example of a tough interview because their process was they had this their main conference room in the building there in Maitland, Florida for Tiburon, which was EA division that did Madden. Their main conference room was a sort of kind of wedgy shaped room with a somewhat wedge shaped giant conference table in the middle of it. And what they did is they put you at the head of it, where the screen was behind your head, but also where all the lights point. And then this group of like 15 people sat around the table. And so it's like you up there and this army of people there, and it's like firing questions left and right. It was really an interesting experience. That was a tough interview, without a doubt. And the questions ran the entire gamut, as you might imagine. But in this case, it was the first time I was interviewing for a job I had basically never done before, because what they were hiring was a development director. And a development director is different from a producer, particularly in the EA system at that time, and still, I think. And that's effectively a project manager. There's a producer as well who handles the and I was familiar with the concept because at Dynamix I was originally a director and then became a director producer. But it was kind of the same idea. But a director was also very design focused at Dynamix. At EA, that was not the case. I was pure project manager. My job was to execute on the vision. So the producer would be responsible for the design vision of the project. And I was responsible for the execution of that design vision, right? So I would have to put together a production plan and then execute it, running the project day to day, while the producer was sort of, from a development perspective, looking at it from the 10,000 foot level and then dealing with all the external parties, the NFLPA or the NFL or what have you, right? So that was a new thing for me, looking at a job like that, but I liked the people. They were they started as a small, scrappy company. I liked their story. I liked the intensity of the people that I met there, and like John Shepard, who founded the place with Steve Chang, and a lot of their other principals there. And so, as I think I alluded to when we spoke last, a lot of the things that matter to me are those intangible things, right? The passion, what is it that gets them up in the morning? That matters to me as much as everything else. And while I didn't think they necessarily had all the answers, their chutzpah, if you will, was such that I found them to be definitely an attractive place to go, and so I jumped in. And so I joined them in '99, and they were just beginning to transition from, or working on the transition for the next console generation jump, the moving from the PlayStation 1 to the PlayStation 2. And this was early development of it. And so I was brought in to, at the same time as another development director, and one of us was going to get the work on the next gen console, and one was going to work on the current gen console. And it was kind of amusing. They left it up to us to figure out. And so the other DD in question, Hugh Falk, and I just...
Oh, I'm familiar with Hugh.
Okay.
Sorry, yeah.
No, that's fine. Yeah, Hugh's good people. And so Hugh and I just talked about it, and ultimately he cared a lot, and I was like ambivalent. So I'm like, sure, man, go ahead. You take, the new, and I will take the old. Because ultimately, to me, it didn't matter, and I knew that the new would carry with it some challenges from my days at SSI, thinking about Dark Sun Engine and so forth. And I'm like, yeah, I'm okay with you taking that one. So drive on. And so he did that, and I did the other, and that's basically how we split it up. And yeah, that's a very intense experience, because it's certainly the first time I'd been used to short duration projects, right? That's not new for me, coming from the days of SSI and so forth. But that machine was something, right? They were just like, it was high speed all the time. Oh, goodness, sorry about the dogs. It was high speed all the time. And so, go ahead.
Can I interrupt? Sorry.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah. Okay. Before we get too far away from it, one more question about the recruiters. So you said you had contacts with outside recruiters at the time.
Yes.
Now, was this because you had they had contacted you previously to try to lure you away to other jobs, or did you know them from your position as a producer having to find talent?
More the former than the latter. So, for instance, I had a relationship with David Musgrove, who was a recruit in the industry forever and ever and ever, back from SSI, right? I think he connected me with the people at Sega, right? Okay. And so more the former than the latter, but certainly by the time at Dynamix, a little of both, right? So I certainly had contact with people on from both perspectives. And again, I generally seek to build relationships with people. I'm a people person. I like people, strangely. And so, I like building those dialogues and building those relationships with people. And so I had, a reasonable range of folks who worked in various capacities who I had come across and who were, viewed me as potentially, like I said, a valuable person to potentially present, because obviously it's their bread and butter if they can, successfully land somebody someplace. And so, I did reach out, when Dynamix happened, I reached out to, pretty much all of my contacts to try and see what I could fish up, because, hey, employment's a good thing. And, I had just gone through, I hadn't really talked about the personal stuff, but, my mom had gotten very ill, and I had been taking care of her towards the end of her life when I was in Eugene. And so while this was all going on, she was in my house, and my wife was taking care of her, and then she passed away, and fairly shortly thereafter, I got laid off. So it was a very tough time. And so, at that point, I was not in a position to sort of go, I think I'm going to take a year off and think about what I want to do. It was more like, I need to go get a job. And so let's go do that. And so, I did. As it turns out, my father, who was considerably older than my mom, decided to basically join me wherever we went. And so when I took the job at, and that's one of the reasons I actually really wanted Ensemble, because he was from Texas originally and kind of wanted to return to Texas. And so he was really rooting for Ensemble because ultimately he wanted to go back to Texas. But I ended up choosing EA, or them choosing me. And so I joined EA, and my dad came along with us. So, we moved together to Florida, which he was less than thrilled with, but, it is what it is. Life throws you curves, and figure out a way to hit them.
Yeah. So when you get to Tiburon, now, obviously,
still have my Tiburon shark up there, see?
Oh, yeah. Now, Tiburon has been doing the Madden games at this point for how many years? Do you happen to know?
Off the top of my head, no, but it's been a while. So I'm sure you know the Tiburon story. And I'm probably not the one to tell it because I was not there at the beginning. But the short form of the story, if you haven't heard it, was effectively that they got Madden away from Visual Concepts by basically being there during a console transition and ready with a version of the game. I think it was the N64 version of the game when Visual Concepts was going to be late. And so effectively, at least this is the story I got from the Tiburon side. So to be fair, I don't have Greg Thomas's perspective on this. But the story as I was told it was effectively that they had been working in parallel to try and get an opportunity to get their toe in the Madden waters. And that opportunity came when Visual Concepts was running behind on the N64 version of Madden. And they were like, well, take a look at ours, and showed it to the Madden execs and the EA execs. And they were like, okay, you can have it. And that led to them, in fairly quick order, taking over the franchise, because they were proven reliable in delivering, and that led to the big shift and the schism and all that jazz. But again, I was not there for it. It had happened quite a few years before I got there at this point, because, like I said, that was N64, and now I'm working on the late versions of the PlayStation 1.
Gotcha.
Right? So, I'm sure you can look up the exact timing of that, but that, it had been a few cycles. But yeah, it was an interesting thing, because now I'm dealing with this annualized product, which is a very, very different experience, right? And so one of the things that's very funny about this, and we'll get into this in a minute, because the EA has a certain, or had at that time, still does, I guess, have certain reputations, and one of them ended up leading to somewhat of a revolution in the industry that later became known as EA Spouse, as I'm sure you're aware. And the reason I bring that up is because Madden is a unique challenge. Actually, any annualized sports game is a unique challenge. So the deal with doing a game like that is that the game has to come out annually, and has to be good, and has to be ready, and has to be complete. And there's no ifs or uts or ifs, ands, or buts about it, right? It's not like you can pick up the phone and call the NFL and say, hey, we're running a little behind. Would you delay the season, please? And so if you know anything about project management, one of the things that you have learned is about the thing called the Iron Triangle.
What's that?
The Iron Triangle. So in simplest terms, it's a triangle with at the various corners of the triangle are quality, price, right, and cost, right? Or cost and time. And so in industry terms, it usually gets shortened to good, fast, cheap. Right. And the idea basically is that you can't have everything, right? You have to sort of lean in a particular direction, right? There's no way that you get to have everything. You can split the difference and end up with kind of the best you can of a compromise, but then you're not particularly cheap, you're not particularly good, and you're not particularly fast, right? Well, the challenge with EA is that we had to be fast because we had to be there every year on time, every time. And we had to be good because we, had a quality bar to meet. And if we blow that, then, you lose the license, you lose market share, et cetera, et cetera. So the only thing that can give is on the cheap side. And that translates to, well, it effectively translates to how do you deal with that? Well, you can either do it by throwing more resources at it, or by working harder with the resources you have, which is a long-winded way of getting to, when you're working on that team, you didn't have any options, right? You had to be there. The game had to be at top quality, and it had to be on time every time. No excuses, no ifs, ands, or buts. It had to be there. And so what that means is that if something goes sideways, the only thing that can give is more labor, and that comes from a variety of ways. You can either pile more people on the project, or those people can work really, really hard. And most often it was the latter, right? So my time there at Tiburon, my first cycle on the game was hard, but it was it was my first time doing this where I'm managing a project through, basically Microsoft Project and managing this entire dizzying array of tasks that we have to accomplish in order to deliver this game. We've been given our list of here's your major hooks, here's your minor hooks. That list is your features. These features need to be executed, and then we need to figure out what things are necessary to support the construction of those features. And then we have to find a way to deliver against that with the resources we have, or put our hands up and say, we need additional help for these things. This was at a time when, the mass outsourcing that we have seen over the last 20 years wasn't really as much of a thing. Those iterations of Madden were pretty much all done by the people sitting in that building. And so we ended up, having to do whatever it took to sort of get that done. The first year I was there, it was a lot of learning experience. It was me figuring out how to do that job and do it effectively. But it went pretty well. Again, I'm working on a legacy console. We kind of know what we have. The engine is stable, et cetera, et cetera. And while, the biggest challenge for me was the fact that, as you would expect with a studio like that, where you had the new hotness and then the old, all the people wanted to work on the new hotness. So the team that I got, my boss described to me as the, quote, island of misfit toys. It was it was, the leftovers is not really the right term, but it was really more the people that they chose not to put onto the other project for one reason or another. In some cases, it was because the person was perceived as difficult, or in other cases, it was because the person had specific affectations that made it a challenge, right? One of them, again, I'm not going to name names for any of this, but one of them was somebody who was known to be very much a hacker from the standpoint of how their code worked. So in other words, it was a lot of scotch tape and baling wire, and it mostly worked, but it was usually buggy and took a lot of debugging at the end to really sort of figure it out. Okay, fine. Another was someone who was perceived as having a very combative personality that they didn't want to, have on the other half at that time. And so this was the team I was sort of asked to take over and manage. And it was fine because that's leaning into my strengths, right? So for me, it was actually great. I got very little attention. That's not the right word. I didn't get a lot of heavy-handed oversight. I was basically expected to deliver that iteration of Madden and do so smoothly, which is Madden 2001, right? And so I just buckled down with the team and worked with them and did the thing that I had learned how to do, which is learning how to lean into the strengths of the people, learning how to help the team sort of cover each other's weaknesses, for lack of a better way of putting it. And the team synergized beautifully. It was, surprising given the way that had been described to me. I had no difficulty with that team whatsoever. In fact, they were one of the best teams I've ever worked with. Fantastic group of people. And so, yeah, we knocked out, our first iteration. And well, I guess the first one would have been 2000. Is that right? It's 2000, 2001. I think it's 2000.
Games, it's the 2001
right,
version.
Yeah, that sounds right. Because I joined in 99, so it would have been cycling into the 2000 year, which is the 2001 football year. Just, I know it was the year 2000, but it makes it Madden 2001. Anyway, so...
Now, did you only work on the N64 version or also the PlayStation version?
PlayStation version as well.
Oh, okay.
And so, yeah, I was the legacy console guy, right? The PlayStation 2 version was being done by Hugh and the bulk of the studio. And in fairness, that's the way it should be, right? I mean, they had to deal with the new engine, the new console. I was just taking what had already worked fine for the last several iterations, so it was fine. Anyway,
now,
go ahead.
A couple of questions here about that development. So, okay, so you have the two. Do you really have one team working on both of those versions, or are they two separate teams? Because the N64 hardware and the PlayStation, the PSX hardware were very, very different beasts.
You are very correct. So the answer to that is largely the PlayStation team was the focus for the internal team. The N64 at that point was being done largely by external partner, right? So they were long-standing friends and colleagues of the founders, and so they had them running the N64 in parallel, again, based on sort of, the legacy code. I was responsible for the PlayStation 1 on a day-to-day basis.
Okay. And how much of the legacy code I can imagine in the early years of the PlayStation, there would have been a lot more tweaking and stuff. Is that not really the case at this point of the life cycle of
not
the
really.
legacy?
Yeah, no, that's not true. I mean, there was plenty of tweaking because understand that, Madden is what it is, right? First of all, we're putting in, somewhere in the vicinity of 8 to 10 new features every cycle. So there's a lot of new stuff, new juice going into the game. And it has to be good and it has to be right. And so there's a lot of work that goes into doing that. And then on top of that, look, Madden is both a football game, but also a UI, right? Because there's a tremendous amount of UI that is necessary to support that style of game. And so we had a huge amount of UI that had to be updated because while we had last year's UI, not only do we have to support all the new features, but it all had to be updated to whatever the new look was going to be, right? And so, we had all the artists having to effectively rejuvenate the UI and the programmer, because we had one primary UI programmer handling everything. Guy was amazing. So ultimately it was, it was a team that had to sort of, put all those pieces together and do that all within the legacy engine that we had without screwing anything up. And so, this team, some of them had pretty good familiarity with that engine, so it wasn't a huge deal. It wasn't like we were taking, code that we'd never seen before. There was some code that was legacy code that, was worked on by somebody who didn't necessarily do the previous, but in many cases it was people who had familiarity with it. So it wasn't a huge obstacle. It was just a lot of work. And so, the team, it led to a lot of late nights and a lot of push, but it wasn't a killing pace. It was just, when we get to the end of the project, it was pretty dense and pretty, heavy duty, amount of work to get that product done and out the door. And the big thing that I took away from that was learning that it was up to me to find a way to make the project smooth, because given the fact that it was what it was, we understood, here's your list of features, here's your list of things that you have to do. It felt like a manageable task to be able to try and make that process smoother. And I did an okay job on 2001. It wasn't, like I said, it wasn't a killing pace project. It was busy, but manageable, and everybody was fine, and nobody was feeling like, oh my God, I'm dying here. But I learned a lot, right? I learned a lot about project management and how to do a better job with that, and how to be able to, it's where I first learned something that I have said to many producers in the years since, which is where I first learned how to predict the unpredictable. And what I mean by that is I learned things about, tricks, not really the right word, but ways that you handle project management that allow you to predict things that will happen even though you don't know exactly what. So what I mean by that is things like we instituted a concept of what we called change order time, right? Change order time was something I started injecting into my schedules from that time because of requests that would come in at the last minute, where they're like, oh, we thought of this new thing we want to do, and we didn't think about it until now, but sorry, but we really want it, and we think it's really important. Or something that goes wrong, and you didn't know what would go wrong, but you're pretty sure because something always goes wrong, it shouldn't be hard to predict that something will go wrong, so simply try to be prepared for that. So the thing I learned is how to manage my leads times better, right? So, one of the first things I took away from that cycle was don't task your leads to 100%, because if something goes wrong, they're putting more on top of that because they have to be involved in the solution of whatever it is. So tasks your leads to, less than that so that you can create this block of time that is reserved for things that you don't know what they are. And that was one of my big takeaways from Madden 01 is that I learned that through the project. And so it taught me a lot about project management. And while, again, it wasn't a killing pace, there are things that I could have done better. And I sort of looked back and went, okay, we did a good job. We can do better than this. Now, understand that one of the other things that's happening at this time is EA is sort of figuring out how to compete in that space, because there are other people playing in the football space, as I'm sure you're aware.
Yeah.
And so they're figuring out how best to operate in that space, because as you know, that was right around the period where the NFL license was coming up for renegotiation. And so it was important for EA to sort of, really make this go smoothly. So that just added additional pressure for us to really get it right, get, the quality of the game right, get the features right, get the project done on time, etc. So anyway, Madden 2001 was a cycle of me learning how to project manage a project like that, how to build synergy with a team that didn't have any yet. And I learned a ton. And I'm very proud of Madden 2001. It was a great game. It was a good version of Madden. And I think it's still on the top 5 of all time Madden by Metacritic rating. It was because this team was so good, and we were able to sort of, like I said, lean into each other's strengths and find ways to really make it pull together in a positive way. So anyway, that was a really good experience for me, and I grew a ton in that first year with Madden. EA taught me a lot, or perhaps the better way to put it is offered me an opportunity to learn a lot, because I think a lot of it was me teaching myself, but that's okay. I was getting some mentoring as well. I learned some really valuable lessons. One of my, so this is a great anecdote. This is one of my favorites. Remember I told you the yes, but story? So from Dynamix? Okay, so this is kind of on that ilk. This is where I learned, and this was on this version of Madden, where I learned that when your boss comes in and gives you an order, don't just follow the order, find out what the problem was and get to the bottom of it, because the order they may be giving you may be telling you the problem is something else. And I learned that lesson with Madden, because John Shepard one day came into my office and he's like, our crowds look like shit. Oh, sorry. I'm not allowed to say that?
No, you're allowed to say it. All
okay.
Good.
He said, our crowds are terrible. We've got to fix this. We need high-res crowds. And I'm like, we don't have the memory for high-res animated crowds. It's not possible. He's like, you need to figure it out. We've got to have high-res crowds. This is terrible. It looks horrible. We can't do this. We can't ship this way. And I'm like, holy crap. Okay. So I go back to the team. They're like, it's not there. There's no memory to make this work. We can't do what he's asking. And I'm like, well, all right. So let's up-res him because he wants high-res crowds. And let's go with, our first draft of this, let's go with static crowds, right? And they're like, it's going to look terrible. I'm like, I know, but he's telling me you got to have high-res crowds. So present that to him. And he's like, this is terrible. There's no enemy. I'm like, I know, I told you we can. He's like, well, that's not going to work. I'm like, okay. And only then did I say, all right, help me understand why you're demanding this. And so he shows me the game. And what it turns out to be is one particular camera shot was too close to the crowd. So when it panned across the crowd, it looked really bad because it was way too close. So it was all pixelated. So I was solving the wrong problem. The problem was not that we needed high-res crowds. The problem was one broken camera. But I pissed away a bunch of time because I didn't ask the right question, right? I just did what he told me. He came in and said, I want high-res crowds. And I'm like, yes, sir, we'll get you high-res crowds. What I needed to do was go and ask, help me understand what's going on here. Show me why you want what you're asking for. Had I done that, I would have saved a good chunk of time that I wasted. Sorry, guys, if any of you are seeing this. I doubt it. Hopefully not. Anyway, I apologize then. I'd still apologize now because that was, a bunch of time just pissed away because I didn't ask the right questions. Taught me a valuable lesson. Ask those types of questions. Don't just, do the thing they're asking you for because they may not mean that. They may mean something entirely else. That was good. A really good lesson, a really good experience. Anyway, so yeah, 2001 was a good project and a good learning experience for me.
Now, a couple of follow-ups because this was legacy, but not just legacy systems. If my understanding is correct, that was the last year that the 32-bit systems were supported for the Madden franchise.
You are correct.
So,
yeah.
What effect or what considerations were taken into account as far as, you're not developing new features that will be taken over and used the next year. So this would have been different from any previous edition from a project planning and budgeting standpoint, correct?
Very good questions. Very insightful. So one of the interesting things here is, remember I said at the beginning, Hugh was running the PS2 team and I was running the PS1 team. So Hugh and a army of people, about twice the size of our team and then some, and all of what they called Central Tech, which is the core technology group building the PS2 support. They were all kind of operating mostly independently, right? Well, I mean, we were in the same building, but they were doing their thing and we were doing our thing. Next year, I took over that team because Hugh went off to do NCAA. And so I'm now running the only Madden team because the PS1 is no longer a thing, right? And that was the year, to the question that you're asking, where we decided that we needed to really sort of, I mean, they had kind of cobbled it together, but they really needed to rebuild some core underlying systems properly for the future generations. And so the decision was made to put the Central Technology Group on a rebuilding of our entire database system that underlies the Madden game. Now, my lead engineer, very, very, very smart and capable lead engineer, his name is Daniel Martin. I'm okay to say that because I have nothing but good things to say about Daniel Martin. Daniel came to me when he reviewed sort of what the plan was, and he's like, there's no way they get that done in 6 weeks. They're telling us to get this whole thing done in 6 weeks. There's absolutely no chance that they're going to get that done. He's like, my estimation of this is that we're looking at, just over 200 man days of work. That team is going to take, longer than that. They're going to miss by probably a month based on the number of people they have and everything else. And I'm like, okay. So I went back and talked to them. They're like, yeah, no, we'll hit our dates. And so we began work on the things we could work on while we were waiting for that. But there's only so much we can do because a lot of stuff hinges on the underpinnings being done. Long story short, Daniel was right. As a matter of fact, he was right exactly in regards to how long. It was a Daniel thing. Quick Daniel aside story. I think it was on the first one. I think it was on Madden 2001. So you know what a fixed fail is?
No.
Okay. So when you get bugs during development, bugs are reported by QA. Those bugs go back to the dev team. The dev team examines the bug, fixes the bug, and sends the bug back to QA marked as fixed. When that bug is not actually fixed, it is marked as a fix fail and comes back to the development team for the development team to try again. Not uncommon. Most people's fix fail rate is going to be a few percent. We had some people with a fix fail rate a little bit higher, some a little bit lower. But everybody has those, right? You thought it was something else, whatever. Except for Daniel. Daniel is, I'm sure, still. I won't say he's a perfectionist, although there's a little bit of that in his personality. But he's also, he's a perfectionist to himself. And so he had a fix fail rate on that first iteration of Madden of 0.
Wow. And
it was funny because at one point, one of his bugs got marked a fix fail and came back to him. And he was like furious. And yeah, I mean, it was like, you've got to go talk to them, blah, blah, blah. And I was like, dude, it's okay. It's just one. Furious. Long story short, he was right. It was not a fix fail. So he ended that year of Madden with a 0 fix fail rate. It's just Daniel. You have to meet him. He's a remarkable guy. Anyway, certainly one of the most talented lean engineers I've been blessed with having through the years, and I've had a few really good ones, like the aforementioned Steve Corden. So anyway, so Daniel was right, and now we're in the really tough spot. We're in the tough spot of now being a month behind on a project that has an 11-month development cycle. That's bad. And we didn't have resources to throw at it. We didn't have outsourcers, armies of people. So we found ourselves in a position where all of my best intentions of what I was going to do to take the learnings from Madden 2001 and apply them to Madden 2002, out the window. And I think it was 2002. I think I had this right. I don't think I'm fast forward.
2002 is the one where you're listed as the head.
Yeah. Well, that would make sense. Which versions did we have on 2002?
You had Xbox, PlayStation 2, and GameCube.
Yeah. Okay.
Whereas 2001 only had the PS2 version.
Yeah. Okay, so this is right. This is the right story. I'm making sure I had my ducks in a row here.
All good.
So we're a hooray behind. And now, to the point of what you just talked about, this is also the first year where we're going to be engaging 2 new platforms. But the trick is, as I'm sure you're aware, having talked to enough people in this industry, they don't necessarily get you the development hardware when it's convenient for you. They get it to you when it's convenient for them. So not only were we already behind because of our own poor planning in regards to our database system that we were putting together, but on top of that, we were doing 2 new consoles. And as you might imagine, PlayStation 2 is not the same as Xbox or the same as GameCube. And we were doing this all on a year where we're already behind. So, long story short is, all of what I learned from Madden 2001, right out the window. It basically, from January on, was full tilt boogie, what the industry has come to lovingly call super crunch.
Super crunch. That's a new one.
We basically, well, I'll put it to you this way. From about maybe February on, my day looked like this. I would get up at about 6 o'clock in the morning and be to work by about 7. I would work through the day until about midnight. And then I would send out my daily reports between midnight and 1 and my final bug distribution. Then I would go home, get to sleep at about 2, get up at 6, and do that again. And I did that 7 days a week from there until September.
Oh, Jesus.
Yeah.
And let me guess, you're 25 at this point, right?
Well, I'm. Let's see. This is 2000. So not quite. I'm a lot older than that. So because I was born in '63. So.
Yeah. No. Yeah. Sorry, I was just slightly sarcastic there. Oh, geez.
Yeah. That was by far the hardest project I've ever done in my career, and it wasn't anybody's fault. There's no finger pointing. I mean, sure, we misestimated on the database system, but ultimately, just because Daniel got that right doesn't mean that, I would beat up the central tech team. They didn't fundamentally screw things up. They just, they had a different perspective. Daniel ended up being right, but they were the ones that had to make the call. They were the ones who had to do the work. It seems only reasonable for them to make the estimations, and so it was what it was. So yeah, we got dealt a bad hand, and so the team pushed hard, and we all pushed hard, and that was the way of things, because that was the only way it was going to get done. Like I said, you can't pick up the phone and call the NFL and say, hey, we're running behind. Do you mind? And so we finaled functionally 3 times because the hardware came in sequentially. So effectively, we finaled the PlayStation 2 version, then we finaled the Xbox version, then we finaled the GameCube version, and then we were done. And they kind of arrived in sequence as well, if I recall right. They weren't like all simul-ship. Yeah, that was a good example of one of those deals where everything went wrong and you just got no choice but to just do it. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I gotta ask. So you obviously have an engine that you're inheriting from 2001 for the PlayStation 2.
Correct.
But it's the first iteration of the PlayStation 2 engine for Madden.
Mm-hmm.
Now, you're coming into this, obviously there's going to, and correct me if I'm wrong in any of my assumptions here, you're iterating on the existing PlayStation 2 engine.
We are.
You have the master database in the background, which is probably also going to be used, for example, for the Windows version, which I do have to ask about here in just a moment.
Yeah, the PC version was done outside largely and managed by a different DD who worked with a largely external team. They were kind of their own thing. They did run in parallel, but they kind of were on their own.
Gotcha. Now, that system, I can imagine you've also got a lot of people who worked on the previous year's PlayStation 2 version on your team at this point, correct?
So, yes and no. Actually, less true than you'd think. So the previous year's team, some of them went with Hugh off to work on NCAA football. The central technology team certainly was involved in the rewriting the database and all that stuff, but they weren't on my team. They were working on pieces of code that we depended on, but I wasn't managing them. They would deliver the things we needed to work with, and then I would go back and liaise with them. But they were organized as their own separate entity, and they supported multiple things, right? Because they were sort of a central shared tech resource. And so, no, it was mostly, yes, there were some, but it was largely the team that did the PlayStation 1 version of Madden 2001. There were some exceptions, but my lead was the same lead from that team. Several of the others were people that came from that, my UI engineer and so forth. We did have a bunch of additional people, though. We had some new hires who came on board for that iteration of Madden. God help them, because welcome to the industry. Well, I like to pour some kerosene on you and light you on fire. But yeah, we had some new people added to the team. We had some of the people carried over from the PlayStation 1 version of Madden 2001, and then some people from that team. So it was kind of a mix. It was definitely a larger team than the PlayStation 1 version. Go figure.
Gotcha. And I do have to ask, because obviously the graphic resources needed to pull a game off on a PlayStation 2 are a different dimension than a PlayStation 1. Yep. Was that problem, keeping the 1 year turnaround timetable, was that solved through simply more hands on deck? Or were there any technical solutions implemented to try to compensate that workload? Or was it really that much bigger of a workload?
It was a bigger workload. By and large, it was more hands. There were some learnings that they used that would allow them to be more effective. There were technology solutions that helped us in regards to, how we handle blend shapes and animation and so forth. But by and large, yeah, there was definitely more hands on deck than there were for the previous iteration.
Gotcha. And I do have to ask, since you said Hugh went off to do NCAA football, is he using the same engine from Madden 2001 for that, or what's the parallel development like?
So great question. And I don't believe so. Again, I wasn't all that close to sort of what they pulled over and implemented, but I believe while there were some pieces perhaps that came across, and there was certainly shared technology. I don't think it was lock, stock, and barrel. I think they had some of their own stuff that was being developed uniquely for them. And I mean, you can tell if you watch those games side by side, they didn't play the same, they didn't run the same, they were different games, and that was by intent. That one of the things that we kind of felt was a commitment to the fans is we didn't want them to feel like, oh, NCAA is just a cheap Madden knockoff. No, it wanted to feel intentionally like a different game. It played differently, it felt different. And it was something that that team was very proud of, and rightfully so. I thought they did a fantastic job with it. So when you played NCAA football, it was a very different experience than when you played Madden. And so to their fan base, I mean, there was for years and years big arguments about which one's better, and it's like, well, that's what you want, right? That's fantastic. You want players to be passionate about their game. And obviously both of them, had some success. NCAA, we know how that all ended, but that I think had less to do with, the game and more to do with other things, as you would imagine.
Oh, of course. Now, back to the other two platforms.
Yes.
I'm trying to imagine what that experience was like. I've heard from smaller developers that obviously getting dev kits was a problem. You guys are in a whole different situation because I can't imagine that that neither Microsoft nor Nintendo doesn't want Madden on their system.
You're right.
So what does, the dev kits you said came in that order, but at the same time, were you guys getting updates on what the hardware specs were going to be, what the adaptations for the graphics were going to have to be, etc.?
Yeah. They were very communicative. First parties, honestly, this is almost universally true, generally are very supportive of developers, particularly developers who are developing AAA product, right? And this was such a circumstance, right? So yeah, they were very supportive. They were there to help. They were, getting us the hardware as fast as they could. They would get us early looks at it. That was all true. They did everything they could to make it better for us. And thank goodness that they did, because it would have been even harder than it already was. But again, going back to what I said when I started this whole thing, the quality bar has to be there, right? We're the premier product in this space, and one of EA's major product lines. So there was no compromise. It had to be top quality all the time. Everything had to be great, and it had to be on time because there's no flexibility. So the reason we ended up being the way that we were, and the reason my wife became, she used the handle EA Widow. For a time during that whole discussion of EA Spouse, she was one of those voices chiming in, even though that was all based out of Redwood Shores, as I'm sure you know. But still, once the dialogues began, there were others like, actually. I don't know how she's put up with me through the years. Anyway, so yeah, it was a tough year, but first party was there in every way that they could be to help us, and to make it, go as smoothly as possible for us. And
what were some of the
into the platforms for sure? I mean, there's always unique stuff that you have to do to sort of make it optimized for the platform, and we did as much as we could to lean into those platforms. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, well, and that was going to be my question. I mean, what were some of the bigger surprises and the differences between those hardware platforms, and how big of a challenge was it to get those? I mean, you have very, very different memory RAM conditions were very different on the three
Sure.
systems. Storage space was different on the three systems, especially with the GameCube. So
Sure.
how did all of those factors play into the design decisions?
I mean, because we had the specs early, we were able to sort of make strategic decisions about what are we going to have to do here? Do we have to down-res assets here? What sort of changes do we have to make? But we knew what we were aiming for, right? So it just became a mathematics exercise. It wasn't really difficult. I mean, it was time-consuming, but it wasn't technically difficult. Understand that PlayStation 2 to Xbox is not nearly as difficult as what later would become PlayStation 3 to Xbox. Yeah, that was much spicier. PlayStation 3, as I know you know, was a really unique beast and did not play well with others. And so that was less true for PlayStation 2 and early Xbox. So it wasn't that horrible. Bringing those across. Yeah, there were technical hurdles, but again, because we had all the information provided to us, that wasn't the thing that was, killing us. What was killing us was the fact that there was just a lot to do to execute those differences and to get all three of those games running at the quality bar that they had to be, knowing that, again, our quality can't slip and our date can't slip. Yeah, it was a spicy meatball to get that one done. Now, understand that at the time, on top of everything else, this is when we are going through the discussions. I believe that was the year we were going through the negotiations with the NFL, right? So we also had to stay on top of our game for our relationship with the NFL and the NFLPA. And that wasn't my doing. Our producers handled that relationship. So, and thank goodness. So I did not have to deal with those relationships. That was, other folks who managed that and managed it well. But we did have to worry about the fact that we had to keep that quality bar there, and there could be no faltering because we were in this competition where we were trying to, be the top of the heap in regards to our negotiations with the NFL and the NFLPA. And of course, there are other people trying to play in the football space in the video game industry. And, that was the beginning of where we really began to eat the market share away from those competitors. In a matter of a 2-year span, which was right in that period, in a 2-year cycle, we went from something like 52% market share to like 98% market share. And that was 2002 and then 2003, the subsequent year where that really happened. And by the end of that, it was pretty much Madden was the only game in town. We pretty much knocked everybody else out of the market. And then we ended up with the exclusive license, which changed the landscape. But to be clear, we didn't get market share because we got the exclusive license. We got the exclusive license because we got the market share. It did not happen the other way around. We got the market share first on the backs of quality games and phenomenal synergy with our marketing team, which is something I'll talk about when we get to Madden 2003. Before I forget, I just have to inject this because it's a funny anecdote. So remember what I mentioned Ensemble Studios?
Yes.
Okay. Remember when I mentioned the interview question that I got from one individual? So, Madden 2001 ships, obviously sells over 1 million units. Sales estimates for it, I think, were supposed to be like 750,000 for the PlayStation version. We did like 1.1 million. And which is great because that's the year the PlayStation 2 drops, but it's still the much larger install base. This is funny because I later had a conversation with somebody who worked at Ensemble about this. So I packaged up a copy of Madden 2001 and sent it anonymously to Ensemble Studios with a sticky note that I put on the outside of the box that said, "Here's one." I didn't address it to anybody specific. I just sent it. Some years later, I'm talking with a colleague through, I'm one of the peer panelists and have been for decades now on the Academy of Interactive Arts and Sciences, right? So every year we're voting in to see who games that go in for Game of the Year candidates and so forth. And I was talking with one of my colleagues on that, and I was like, "Hey, you were at Ensemble for a time in this period." He's like, yeah. I was like, "Got a question for you. Do you remember a copy of Madden showing up in the mail?" He's like, "Yeah." I'm like, "Yeah, that was me." And I explained the whole thing. He was like, "We wondered what the hell that was." I'm like, "Yeah, I just want to make sure it got there. That makes me feel good." So anyway, I just had to mention that just because it was one of those moments of triumph that nobody gets to know about, but it just, made me feel good. So anyway, side note, I had to sidetrack you there. So anyway,
no problem. So I do have to ask, because one of the big differences between PlayStation 2, Xbox, and GameCube was the number of controller ports. So because Xbox and GameCube had the 4 controller ports, was there, and I have to unfortunately admit my complete and total lack of knowledge about the intricacies of the Madden franchise, was there a 4-player option, or was there discussion of 4-player options for those 2 consoles?
So there were discussions. That was not the year that we added that. I believe I'm gonna have to check my own notes, to be honest. I don't remember when independent, sort of 2-player quarterback and receiver control got added. That did happen, but it was not on that iteration. So it wasn't there for the first iteration of it. At least I'm pretty sure. I don't remember it, and I would pretty sure I would have remembered that kind of pain. But because that would have been unique for that console only, and I don't recall us doing that until later. So I think that was either the next year or the year after that where that became a feature of the franchise. And by that time, that was, I think it was actually at a time where that was no longer a problem. But keep in mind that even on the PlayStation 2, as I recall, no, I can say that with confidence, there was a way to get a port expander.
Yeah.
And I believe when we first did it, that makes me think it was 2003. But anyway, when we first did it, I believe you could use the port expander to effectively do that, where you could have the one person playing receiver, one person playing quarterback. I'm pretty sure that was true even on that version. But I don't think it was 2002. I think that was post 2002. I think that was 2003.
Okay.
But again, you're asking me things from a long time ago. So.
No, of course. I was just curious because of the feature set in question,
right.
and
yeah, legitimate question. Yeah. I believe the first time it happened, it was because people were just using the port expander. Strangely, I actually have a PlayStation 2 port expander sitting on that desk right over there.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Anyway.
2004 on the back says players
Okay.
1 through 4.
That sounds right. So that makes more sense in my head. And that wasn't even me anymore, because that was after I went off to work on NFL Street.
Gotcha.
So I did 3 turns of Madden. I did 2001, 2002, 2003. And then I went off and took a small team, a seed team, if you will, from my team, and we went off to build NFL Street. But we can talk about that in a minute.
Yeah. Now, one more question that from a layout standpoint, the PlayStation 2 and the Xbox controllers pretty much comparable.
Yeah.
but the GameCube controller, slightly different beast.
Oh, very much so. Yes, very much so.
All I have to say is, as a person with very large hands, I thought the N64 controller was bad, and I did not know what I was up against when I hit a GameCube controller.
You are not wrong. That was really, really interesting. Yeah.
So, first off, how early in development were you aware of what that controller was going to be?
I would say relatively early. Again, as I recall, they had a prototype controller that ended up slightly changing before the final controller, but we still kind of knew what we were up against. So, but to be candid, understand the project and what the arc we were on. That was one of the things that fell squarely into the category of, we'll do what we can do, man, sorry. I think we ended up with something that was competent, and it was, certainly pretty exciting for GameCube players to be able to play that game on that console. Because not always has that been the case where, the Nintendo console of choice can play comparably. Switch. Anyway, it's I think the experience was still very satisfying for people, but we didn't, lean into it and sort of go, well, let's do whatever we can do to make this a perfectly customized, tailored for the N60 or for the GameCube experience. For just make it work, man. People will figure it out.
Okay. Yeah, that sounds perfectly correct. So now you've got these 3 versions of the game up and running. Oh, and I do have to go back to that database that you were talking about.
Mm-hmm.
So what kind of data was going to be shared through this database? Because I'm thinking, okay, it's going to be player stats, scans of people's faces, things like that.
Yep.
Was it also in the UI graphics and so forth? But was it going to be any kind of gameplay or physics-based information as well?
No, not really. No, the database that underpins, or at the time underpinned the Madden system, was really about the data, right? So it was basically the engine on which the data part of the game runs: player performance, player stats, and while yes, the math underpinning some of the things that feed into the physics system was there, the physics system was not a part of that database. It just took the data from the database that fed the graphic or the physics engine, right? So it was purely a data management system. But there's a lot of data, and there's a lot of things that have to be, that have to work right and feed correctly to the right places in the right ways for that to work, which is why we kind of were stuck, not able to really move forward without that iteration being completed, because otherwise, and actually there was a certain amount of this happened anyway. What you end up doing is make some speculative runs at it, and you're like, well, it's probably going to work about like this based on what we see so far, so let's just start. Oh crap, now we got to rewrite that because it's a little different than we thought it was going to be. And some of that happened too, but that's the nature of the beast. Sometimes you have to take the best guess you can and hope it works out, and sometimes it does, and sometimes it doesn't. And we had a little of that as well. But ultimately, some of the stuff we just ended up having to wait until they were done, and then we could begin. And like I said, it was about a month behind.
Oh, wow. Now, you mentioned that Tiburon was running on a system where you as the director were in charge of making sure that the bigger design decisions got implemented, if I'm understanding.
Yeah, I ran the development team. Right.
Yeah.
And so the producers in that space run the design, which means they write the design documents. They write the specs that say this is how this is supposed to work. and they're responsible for, all of that ideation, right? They worked, and then they work with all the external parties like the NFL, the NFLPA, publishing, et cetera, et cetera. The development director's job is to build the game, right? So I was responsible for the physical implementation of everything. So I was running the groups that would make that vision get realized. And so on a day-to-day basis, I worked most tightly with the engineers because ultimately they were, the game was built on software engineering. I worked closely with the art director who would supply the arts to the same specs, and so forth and so on, audio department and so forth. We'd pull all the assets together and build the game. So for all intents, we were the development team. The producers, I don't want to say that they weren't part of the development team because they absolutely were, and they sat there with us and worked tightly with the engineers to make sure that those things were implemented right and made changes as necessary and so forth. But the the producer group was perhaps in that environment best thought of as the design team, gotcha. As well as having responsibility for other stuff outside of that.
Now, the decisions that they were making as far as design or feature additions to the system, those were also coming at a yearly rate.
Yep.
Now, was there any kind of multi-year planning in that system?
Sort of. Actually, the best way I can describe it, and this is pretty much how it worked for those iterations, they had a list of things that they thought were potential features. And the ones they really liked, they would make are what they called major hooks. And so they would choose 3 to 5 of those, and those would be the things we would hang our hat on. They would be all over our marketing. They would be the things all over the back of the box. These are the big things for this iteration of Madden. And then they would have 4 or 5 what we called minor hooks. Everything that didn't make the list is the beginning of next year's list. Right?
Gotcha.
Now, other stuff would get added, and sometimes would supersede stuff that was there before. But there were ideas that sat there for potentially 3 or 4 years, only to finally surface once they felt the time was right for it. And some of that, I mean, to the credit of the design and marketing team, and I'll talk about marketing here in a minute, they really did do their homework in trying to figure out what the right time was for the right feature, right? So, for example, they would lean heavily into, specific offensive changes when, the NFL was at the heyday of passing, right? Or if a really strong defense, the old defense wins championships thing was happening, that became our tagline that year, right? So there was a lot of very careful intent to what got surfaced from that list. The design team really gave that careful thought and worked with marketing to make that, determination on what the right choices were. It wasn't willy-nilly at all. I won't say that they had a clear 5-year plan of, okay, Madden 2004, we know we're going to have this major feature as our top feature. Then 2005 will be that one. It was done on an annual basis, but they had several really interesting choices that they've been thinking about for a while that they were like, okay, you know what? This feels like the right time based on how the NFL is right now. Let's make this one go this year. Does that make sense?
Gotcha. Yeah, no, it makes sense. Now, and I know we need to get to the marketing, and I desperately want to get to that one too. But going back to your experience with QA, with playtesting, since you have this constant addition of new features, was there, and they had been doing this for so many years, was there some kind of internal algorithm or philosophy regarding how many features that are active choices from the player are too many, and how many features that are underlying in the code, sort of additional processes that the player doesn't see directly but affect the game, are too many that would make predictability of play results too far removed from the player's actions?
Sure, good question. And yeah, actually, the production team spent a lot of time thinking about things like that. There was a lot of careful thought put into how those parts of the engine operated, how ranging from sort of controllability of the player to player growth and career modes to what have you. All of that was stuff that was done with fairly careful attention to detail and with intentionality. It was one of the things that I think EA, it was part of what made EA great, was that they paid attention to those level details. And it's really easy to overlook the value of that attention to detail, but EA really did that very, very well. And I think that felt that way all the way up and down, right? So in other words, there wasn't pressure, well, until maybe a little bit later, but there wasn't pressure from on high to sort of go, oh, just whitewash it and just ship it out there. There was much more about, Tiburon was largely left alone, right? And in fact, our executive producer at the time, a guy by the name of Jeremy Strouser, had originally been at Redwood Shores at EA and then moved and embedded at Tiburon and stayed. And so, for all intents, what started out as I'm the publishing producer in charge of the design to I'm the guy in charge of design who sits with the team. And, that had great value. And once that happened, EA kind of was like, just make us games, man. Just make us tons of money, please. And they largely left Tiburon alone to do it because they were doing it successfully. And EA had the wisdom, at least at the time, to leave it alone and let them do what they do. And part of that also, I'm sure, had to do with John Shepard being a force of nature, which he is, even to this day. I still work with him. He just works at another company now. Yeah, and I think that added to the value and added to the success of the franchise because the teams were able to have this really great focus on what's going to make it work for the player, what's going to make the player engage, what's going to make this really resonate with the fans. And that period of Madden was really successful because that's kind of how that team operated. The design team, the development team, and the marketing team were like this in lockstep at every time. That one of the big changes that was made during that period is they embedded the marketing manager for the game, the product manager for the game, embedded with the team. He sat with the development team. He was there all the time. We were working hand in hand. He knew what we were doing. We could sit down with him and say, this is what we're doing with the game and show it to him. And, that level of partnership is not how a lot of places operated. When you look at the sort of marketing driven top down, here is what we have decided is going to resonate with our fans, go forth and make it happen. It didn't work that way here. The team was very much a collaboration working across these various groups, which is the reason that EA went from 50% market share to 90% market share in 2 years. Because all of the people up and down that process were committed to those results and committed to building great games for the fans and understood that their success hinged on that team working together in that way. And that led to the success of the franchise during that era.
And that brings us then obviously to this marketing discussion. And you said that in the 2003 edition of the game, that's when marketing. You were mentioning something about marketing being extremely important with that iteration.
Well, that was where we did this embedding, where effectively the marketing manager embedded with the team, and marketing and development started working side by side, hand in hand, so that what marketing was doing to promote the game was directly reflected by what the game was doing for the player, how the game was executing. And so they had complete visibility into what worked, what didn't work, what was really singing as a feature, and were there to be able to really sort of characterize it. And so that partnership led to such a tremendous quality out the back end for the product that, frankly, our competitors never stood a chance because none of them were doing that. None of them worked that way. And EA's executives, in their wisdom, allowed us to work that way. And that resulted in great things. And, that for me, that was a huge lesson in learning how important that synergy can be. When your marketing team works in close partnership with your development team, where one of them is not viewing the other as the ones that take orders, that's a great place to be, and you get really great results out the backside.
So the marketing people truly understood what the features were. They weren't just getting secondhand reports or stat lists or whatever from you guys. How did that manifest itself in the marketing efforts?
Well, let me interrupt and say it's actually more than that. They had opinions to share too. So it was a two-way dialogue, right? It wasn't just passively, okay, tell us what's going to happen. Cool, we'll work with it. It was much more interactive where they're able to say, well, from our research, this and this and this are true. And we see when we talk to the fans, this really seemed to resonate. Here's what we're learning on the user research side. And so the design team could take that information and go, okay, well, what if we did this to try and lean into what you learned here? That's what I mean. It was a two-way dialogue.
Wow.
And that's really the cornerstone of it, is by doing it that way, marketing had an opportunity to have a hand in the process, not just as a passive participant, and not as the other side, the more at certain periods of time, the Activision-y side. I like to pick on them because where they will say, "Here's the mandate, do these things." It's like, okay, we'll do these things. No, it was very much a partnership, top to bottom, and so. The director of, and on 2003, the director of marketing, who was at Redwood Shores, spent a significant portion of the project on site as well. And so effectively the entire marketing team, the entire development team, all sitting side by side, figuring it out together to put out the best product we could. And in the case of Madden 2003, I had the advantage of now finally getting a chance to put all of what I learned from the previous two iterations into use, and probably had the smoothest project I've ever shipped, where effectively I properly managed the team, so where pretty much there was no crunch to speak of. Everything executed relatively smoothly. We worked one weekend a month, where we would work a day maybe and a little bit long that week right before the milestone was due, and then that was pretty much it. We hit alpha. We worked, I think, maybe 2 weekends, and that was it. Understand alpha in EA terms at that time meant the game's done.
Oh, wow.
In the terminology that they used then, alpha was feature complete. Everything is in. The only thing that was missing is some of the art. Beta was content complete, everything is done. The only thing that's left is final polish and bug fixing. And then it was literally just from beta to ship was the bug curve going to 0. That's it.
Wow.
So, and that is how 2003 ran. It was like smooth as silk, and is, one of the projects that I'm most proud of from the standpoint of it executed almost flawlessly. The team all knew what they had to do. We were working on stable platform. We had all the, we understood what we were building. We had this fantastic synergy with marketing. Everything was hitting on all cylinders. It was a really, really great experience, which was a nice change from the previous year, which was a little rougher.
Now, with the introduction of the Xbox into this mix,
yes,
obviously online gaming in the first year not so much, but Xbox Live is coming up online.
Yep.
Were you there when those discussions began?
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah. I mean, yeah, online became a thing for us, and it was one of those things where we knew we wanted to lean into it. We knew we wanted it to be a big part of our future experience for the game. And so there was a lot of focus around getting that running. It was not a small deal, getting everything working right. That was, that led to a very exciting year where we actually demonstrated online play live for the first time. And I don't know how to say this delicately. We were pretty sure it was going to work. But I mean, we had, it had worked in tests, but not sort of in this way. And it was literally right up to the last second thing, so that I'm trying to remember who the other person we set. It was Dante Culpepper, and I forget who his opponent was, playing Madden live, televised online as a demonstration. And that was kind of our first hey, we're going to show it to the world. And it was really fresh at the time we did that. So it was one of those hold on to your butts moments. But it worked. And, the team was incredible. I don't want to sell it like it is untested, because it wasn't untested, but it was, there was a lot that went into getting it up and running and ready. But we did do that, and that was that year. So, and part of that had to do with the fact that the project was, like I said, well planned, and we planned from the beginning that this was something that we were going to do as a part of the project.
Gotcha. Now, was that implemented on the Xbox version or just on the Windows version?
No, it was implemented on the Xbox version.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, but this was before Xbox Live.
Yes, it was. I think so. I'm trying to remember now.
Yeah, because I'm looking at the Xbox box, and there's no Live logo on it.
You're correct. And I think that was before that. But, I mean, that was the sort of the leading edge of that tech, right? So.
Yeah. So now you go off to you don't keep with the Madden a franchise. You go off to do a spin-off, if you will, another NFL license. Why did you leave Madden after you had gotten the system running as well as you did?
That's a really great question. The simple answer is not simple. There is no simple answer. There's facets to it. One of the facets is that I was feeling a little bit pigeonholed. I had become Mr. Reliable, right? They were like, this is great. We can just do this forever. This guy will just crank out the Maddens and we're good. And I was feeling a little underappreciated. And, I was handing out fat bonus checks and not seeing fat bonus checks. And I was just feeling a little bit like, hey, man, I can do more than this. And one of the other things is that I had kind of gotten with 2003, I felt like I had really gotten a rhythm to where we kind of had it down. And so it felt like between the I'm feeling a little underappreciated thing and I would like to move up the ladder and grow, understand that Tiburon was, there was a little bit of an old boys club thing. The founder and his team were all the leadership group. So I'll tell you a funny story. So this is probably the best way I can explain it. And this didn't happen then. This happened a little bit later, but this was the final manifestation of what I'm trying to talk about here. Eventually down the line, this is while I'm working on NFL Street, I'm sort of saying, hey, I really want to have a seat at the table. I feel like I'm contributing. I feel like I'm doing what you asked me to do. I just want to have a seat at the table. I just want to have a voice. I would like to be part of the senior staff. And they're like, we totally understand. We're 100% with you. We absolutely appreciate you. Yes, absolutely. So they added me to the senior staff meeting, which took place on Mondays. And then they created a meeting on Tuesdays, which is the exact same group minus me.
Oh.
And I'm like, really? Right? And it's just like, okay, well, I'm not sure. I guess I'm taking the message here, right? And it wasn't through malice. At least I don't believe so. I think it was really just this group was comfortable together. It was like a good old pair of jeans, right? They all knew each other. They finished each other's sentences. I was the new guy, relatively speaking, even though I've been there for a few years now. And so that was what that sort of, hey, I want to do more stuff is what led me to ask, inquire about NFL Street. And it was something that they had been exploring, wanting to do. Understand that Tiburon was wanting to expand and branch out, right? They had the experiment with Superman, which was a debacle. But, obviously they had NASCAR going now. They had NCAA football going now, and they were trying to grow. They were trying to, and NFL Street was where they looked at the success of Blitz from Midway, and they were like, we think we can, learn from what they've done and apply that with the NFL license, and we can really have something here. And so that led to us doing Street. And this was also an opportunity for me to exert my creative side because I had that background, as we've talked about. And so I was actually both the development director and the producer on that project. So I was now responsible for both sides of the fence. I was responsible for running and executing the project, but also for leading the vision creation of the project. And it was great. They were trying to be good and give me the opportunity that I asked for, and they did. I had a small team of 20 odd people. A lot of them pulled from my Madden team. And we were given a longer cycle because there was not a specific timetable. So we basically got, 18 months to build this game. And that was fantastic. And what we ended up with, I'm incredibly proud of. NFL Street was not actually just the Madden engine. Once again, we took that and then built it in a new direction. Everything worked differently. Right? Even how you interacted with the field worked differently. Players felt different. Everything felt different. And that was by intent. And it was very much a passion project for that whole team. I mean, everybody in that project was all in. It was, a love of the project type thing for the whole team. And it felt very much like, the sort of the perfect situation there where the team was just all in sync, and we had great relationships with the players, so we were able to leverage that as well. NFL Street, we got Barry Sanders onto the field in Redwood Shores to help promote the game, which was fantastic. I mean, it was just an incredible experience. And so it was a longer cycle, a smaller team. And we delivered NFL Street. It sold, 7 figures. It felt like the birth of a new franchise. And then things changed. Now, I already had the tension I talked about a second ago with the Tiburon and the Old Boys Club, but that really wasn't the problem. The real problem was we started development of NFL Street 2. We worked into the concept phase. It was going to be a 2-year cycle because one of the big takeaways we learned from Midway and what they were doing with Blitz is that arcade sports is not an annualized segment. In fact, it shouldn't be. Every time Midway tried to do it annually, they blew their sales out because they got half the numbers the next iteration because it was just too fast. Doesn't need to be that for an arcade sports title. It's kind of a different beast. And we did all the demographic research to sort of, demonstrate this, user research. And so we're several months, well, not several months, like 2 months into development through the concept phase for Street 2. And I'm doing my presentation to the executives. So the executives fly out, and it's Bing Gordon, and it's, oh man, my brain is jamming on me here. Who is head of studios? Don Matrick. And I forget who his number 2 is. But they all come out to the studio, and I do my presentation. Well, that's not quite true. I start to do my presentation. I did not finish my first sentence, where I was explaining what our plan for Street 2 was. Don Matrick interrupted me and then proceeded to tell me that he had a hole in his Q4 and we were going to fill it. And so he wanted us to take NFL Street 2 and get it out before Christmas. Now, this is April.
Oh, Jesus.
And we're like, okay. So he wanted us to go from a 23-month cycle to an 11-month cycle, 2 months into development.
Oof.
Anyway, he finished telling me his expectations, and then I was told to leave. So I never even presented any of my materials. I never uttered a single sentence. That was it. Afterwards, I remember the conversation. I went to Steve Chang and asked him about it, and he was like, you have to understand, Don Matrick doesn't really want to hear what you've had to say. He just wants to make sure you've heard what he has to say. That was verbatim.
Wow.
Long story short is I did what I was told. We ramped the team massively, added a whole crap ton of additional heads, and we shipped the game. Actually, they pulled our ship date in again later. So we basically made NFL Street 2 in like 10 months.
Oh, jeez.
Not surprisingly, it didn't do as well. We internally called it Street 1.5 because that's really what it was. And also it was a huge crunch. I mean, all of our things that we were doing to learn about how to build projects the proper way went out the window. The team had to crunch to figure out a way to make this happen. And so I led this team, and to be blunt, I feel like ended up kind of effectively betraying their trust because I had been the one saying, no, we know how to do this right. And then promptly told them, no, we're going to do it wrong. Let's go. And, it's the old adage about a total segue here. But so I have a military background, as you know, and I've always been interested in that aspect. I have a lot of friends in the military. And I actually graduated from military school right before I went into the military. Anyway, I digress. But the reason I'm saying that is because there's this great story that stuck with me through the years. And this was an example of what I did here on Street 2. It's the old adage about the young lieutenant, the old sergeant, and the young lieutenant asking the old sergeant questions about, the various scenarios. It's like, okay, well, what if they have you flanked over here? And he'd sort of explain what you do. And then, basically the lieutenant kept adding more and more challenges and problems until effectively it was an impossible scenario where you effectively were up against impossible odds and being asked to do something basically suicidal. And the sergeant just sort of looks at him and goes, well, sir, that's when you say, follow me, boys, and then stand up and go. And so that was me on Street 2. It was like, well, I just have to lead them through this. And so I did. The result of that was catastrophic. Basically, at the end of Street 2, I quit. Half my team quit. And basically, the NFL Street team imploded, and that was that. They scattered to the winds across the industry. I left as well. And that is that. There was no Street 3. And the franchise was eliminated. It is a shame because I think we had something special and it ended up not going our way because ultimately we were slaves to the almighty financial quarter.
Now, the reactions that you told us the reaction of of one of the heads of the studio, but what was the reaction inside of Tiburon to the end result of you leaving the team, a big chunk of the team leaving? Was there any attempt from Tiburon management to try to salvage the situation?
Well, first of all, to be completely fair, we kind of didn't give them that opportunity. I didn't go in and say, hey, Steve, I'm going to leave, and give him an opportunity to convince me to stay. I said, hey, Steve, I've got a job and I'm going to go take it. I didn't offer him an out because I didn't want to put him in that situation. I didn't want to play that game with him. Like, hey, if you do this thing for me, I won't screw you. It just felt disingenuous. And so I didn't do that. I just went to him and said, hey, here's my reasons. Here's what I'm doing. This is the decision I've made. I'm sorry. And he was fantastic about it. He's like, you know what? This is on us. We should have done more. I'm very sorry. And I understand. It certainly wasn't his fault. And ultimately, I'm not even sure I could say it's Don's fault. I have no doubt that he was under very specific pressure from the board of directors to say, you must deliver X by Y, and you have to figure it out. And so, I'm not naive enough to go, oh, well, he's just an evil person that made a decision that destroyed a franchise. He made the best decision I assume he could at the time. And the result was unfortunate. But the result was basically the death of a really promising franchise, and a whole lot of people dispersing from EA that, were really, really talented. And plenty of them are still there. Some of those people that were on that team that we built are still there and now, very senior and very, very good at what they do. They were good then, but, have grown up to become directors and so forth. My former lead programmer, Daniel Martin, from Madden, went off to work on the Frostbite engine for EA for years, all of those people went on to great careers in various places in the industry. So it was a remarkable team I was fortunate enough to have at that time, and I'm sad that I wasn't able to deflect what ended up being, like I said, the disassembly of that franchise and unfortunately, the disassembly of that team.
Gotcha. And the new position that you took, I'm guessing this is at Crystal Dynamics.
Correct. So when I decided that I was going to leave EA, I went shopping, and a number of places sort of, expressed interest in talking to me. Activision actually made me an offer. I talked to Microsoft again, although I'm not sure why. That's a long story. Microsoft had, for the longest time, the weirdest interview processes, right? They would do things like, one of the interviewers would ask you to do things like QA a Coke can or design a candy machine on a whiteboard. It's like, yeah, it was a very weird process. And I mean, apparently Microsoft had a reputation for doing this for a long time, but whatever. Anyway, so I talked to Microsoft again, and I had talked to them before. But, this time I was taking a real sort of swing at it because they seemed like, they had some franchises that I had really strong interest in. And so I was, definitely flirted with the idea of landing there. I ended up sort of late in that process, but I didn't hit it off well with Phil Spencer. And I think specifically what I said wrong is I said less than fantastic things about a decision that they had made, and I think that ended the interest there. But it doesn't matter anyway. But Crystal made a pitch to pull me out, and it was funny. And I talked to them after I ended up joining Crystal, and they were like, we didn't think we had a shot at getting you. I was like, really? He's like, yeah. I mean, what? You've been doing these products, and did 3 iterations Madden, NFL Street, blah blah blah. You're dropping out million unit selling games, and now you're going to come here, and and we're trying to get the first iteration of Tomb Raider out the door for this. We have high hopes, but and I'm like, well, I like the idea, I like the team, I like what I've heard, so let's do it. One of the things that I had developed a bit of a reputation for was being able to stabilize projects. When I joined Tiburon, it wasn't a stabilize this project deal completely, but they did have a lot of holes in their processes, and I needed to figure out how to navigate that and fill them and fix their processes, and I did that. Crystal was a similar type of challenge, but only a little more of a pure firefighting situation. They had Tomb Raider Legend that was well into development, but it was struggling to get to alpha, and we were massively late and massively over budget, and they were pretty candid during the interview process and just saying, we need some help trying to figure this out. And so I thought it was a challenge that I could take on. I thought the things that I had learned would help me, and so I said yes and jumped in. Moved back. Oh, go ahead.
Sorry. Just to go back to that now, that reputation that you had built, and again, this goes just to get a feel for the industry at the time and the interactions between people. How does a reputation like that get out into the zeitgeist, or how do people know about these internal processes at a company like Tiburon well enough to have that knowledge of, this guy does this guy does that? Is this coming from conversations at GDC? Is it coming from people leaving the company and telling stories? How does that information get out?
That's a great question. And truth be told, it's all of those things. Some of it's networking, some of it's people who have left and then, carried that word. It's actually a uniquely challenging problem for me versus some other people because I intentionally fly under the radar. I have, throughout my entire career, always tried to push other people into the spotlight, not because I'm afraid of the spotlight, but because I want my team who who are doing heavy lifting to be rewarded for that work. And I want them to be celebrated. I've always kind of felt that way. I've always kind of felt that for me, the greatest achievement is not getting some big public recognition, but rather getting recognition from my peers, getting recognition from people that I respect, right? And so for me, that was the most important asset. And so that has presented some unique challenges through the years because I was not as well known. I'm still not as well known, right? I guarantee you when, Ed Boon was kind enough to mention me among the people that he thanked when he was getting his Hall of Fame award at AIS 2 years ago at DICE, that most of the people in the room had no idea who I was, right? And that's okay. That has never bothered me. It doesn't bother me. So to your point, how does that work? And the answer is, to some extent, it's a little bit of networking, a little bit of, like you said, people moving around the industry. One of the places I entertained, actually, I have to tell this story because it's funny. When I left EA, one of the places, or when I was about to leave EA, one of the places I interviewed with was Midway. Now, Midway was going through some tough times at that time. But I came up and I interviewed for a position as basically their, kind of their studio head, if you will, or head of production, really. So right below their studio head. And that was interesting because I got to meet Ed Boon for the first time there. He didn't remember me later. It's okay. And Matt Booty was the head of the company then. Matt Booty now being in charge at Microsoft, as you know. And so interviewed with those guys. And the reason I got that interview is because one of our engineers at EA, who I worked very closely with, one of the central technology people, went there and was their CTO and basically talked me up to them. So they brought me up to talk to them. I ultimately decided not to go in that direction because they looked like they were on fire, which they were, because we know how it ended not long after that. Mm. So that was a nope. But it was, it's that, to your point of your question, was directly because somebody that I had worked closely with, who I had a good relationship with, had said, "Oh yeah, you got to get this guy." And there's been plenty of those. At Crystal, it actually really was much more about the discussion. I mean, basically, I saw the job, I applied to it out of interest. That led to interviews, and during the interviews, they were like, "Holy crap, we got to talk. We got to grab this guy," because they liked what I described in regards to how I worked and how I operated and what my goals were, and so it resonated with them. So in that case, it was really mostly about the live interactions, and they're going, "Oh, this is our guy." And so combination is the answer to your question.
Okay, cool. Yeah, no, and it's, I guess that is one of those things, it's behind the scenes type of stuff that's hard to really imagine. I mean, again, the landscape has changed with LinkedIn and so on and so forth, getting information about people. So many interviews with people are readily available online and so forth, that a potential employer is going to have different sources of information about people going into the process.
That's true. It was not true then, though, now, at that time. Now it is, but it was not true at that time. Okay. Moby Games is weird, though. Moby Games is very catch as catch can, because it's not always complete, and it sometimes leads to, there's stuff, I think there's stuff in my Moby Games, and I'm like, really? So, I mean, I don't know. There are places, for example, where I've been listed as having BioShock in my credits. It's like, no, not really. I'll tell you the extent of my participation in BioShock. It was like 2 conversations and a little bit of commentary from a playtest. That's it. That was the extent of my contribution to BioShock. So, but yet somehow it ended up on one of those lists. I don't know if it was Moby Games or something else, but anyway. But you're correct in your assertion that things have changed, and at that time, a lot of those resources didn't exist. It was much more word of mouth, much more network, and or recruiters. And like I said, I had great relationships with a whole bunch of different, professional recruiters who had these relationships with these various companies, so I could get my foot in the door anywhere, and frequently did. I mean, I've mentioned Activision a few times. I've entered there 4 times.
Oh,
And
wow.
I've gotten 2 offers. Yeah, 2 offers, and I've turned them both down. But I've interviewed there many times. Those latest was actually before I came here. I interviewed with Blizzard, and was interviewing for a lead tech producer for them. And they ended up opting for their other lead candidate that they liked. They ended up down to a battle of 2 people, and they chose the other guy, which is fun. So I've interviewed with the Activision family, not counting when they took over in the back old days after I left, but have never actually landed with them. But I still talk about them a lot because they're Activision.
Of course.
I hope you've enjoyed this interview episode. Check back soon for part 4 of interview. Find out what the next stage will be. Trust me, it gets really interesting. I hope you've enjoyed another Video Game Newsroom Time Machine interview. You can leave us comments on Twitter, Instagram, and if you like what we're doing here, drop us a couple of bucks on Patreon. All the links are in the description below.